You can't fix this town, Eli. It's been this way for as long as I've been alive, said Pastor Edwards, his tone weary but firm. Eli Carter didn't answer right away. He stood by the cracked window of the old church, looking out at the dusty streets of East Haven. His tall, broad-shouldered frame seemed to absorb the weight of the town's silence. I don't know about fixing it, Pastor, Eli said finally, his voice low and steady. But maybe it's time someone tried. The room fell quiet. Around the table sat a handful of community leaders, men and women who had fought their battles with East Haven's unspoken rules and carried the scars to prove it. Eli wasn't a preacher, a politician, or even a teacher. He was just a handyman, the man people called when something was broken. But today, he wasn't here to fix leaky pipes or squeaky doors. He was here to confront the fractures in the soul of the town itself. East Haven was a town where change came slowly, if at all. The wide, dusty streets carried the whispers of a history most would rather forget, and the lines dividing black and white communities were etched deep into its foundation. People didn't talk about it, but everyone knew their place. The black neighborhood, called the Ridge by locals, sat on the edge of town. Its houses were small and weathered, their paint peeling under the relentless southern sun. The people who lived there worked hard, cooking, cleaning, building, mending, but they knew better than to expect gratitude. Eli Carter had grown up in the Ridge. His father, Henry, had been the preacher at the local church, a man known for his booming voice and unshakable faith. His mother, Ruth, was a teacher who believed that education was the key to freedom. Together, they had taught Eli to hold his head high, even when the world seemed determined to keep it low. Always do the right thing, son, his father used to say, even when it costs you. Eli had tried to live by those words, but East Haven didn't make it easy. By the time he was 18, he had already learned that doing the right thing often came with a price. It was a sweltering summer evening when Eli first encountered the full force of East Haven's ugliness. He had been walking home from a friend's house, the cicadas buzzing in the humid air, when a car pulled up beside him. "Hey, boy," a voice called. Eli froze. Inside the car were three young men from the white side of town, their faces twisted into sneers. He recognized them, sons of powerful families who could get away with just about anything. "What are you doing out here?" one of them demanded, leaning out the window. "I'm just heading home," Eli replied, his voice calm but cautious. "Home?" the driver said, laughing. "You mean back to the Ridge where you belong?" Before Eli could respond, the driver stepped out of the car, a menacing grin on his face. "Let's teach this boy some respect." Eli didn't run. His father had taught him that running only made things worse. But standing his ground didn't help either. That night, he went home with bruises on his body and a lesson seared into his mind: East Haven's rules were enforced with fists as much as words. As Eli grew older, he learned to navigate the unspoken rules of East Haven. He found work as a handyman, fixing things for both black and white families. People in town came to respect his skill and his quiet reliability, though few truly saw him. "He's a good worker," they would say, as if that was all he was. Eli didn't mind. He kept his head down, worked hard, and helped where he could. But beneath his calm exterior, a slow-burning anger simmered. He couldn't forget the injustice he had endured, or the stories he heard from others in the Ridge. Still, Eli stayed in the shadows. He wasn't the kind of man who gave speeches or led protests. He was just one man trying to get by. That changed the morning he stood in the wreckage of the church. It happened in the spring of 1974. East Haven had been suffering through one of its worst droughts in decades, and tempers were running high. Farmers were losing crops, businesses were struggling, and people were looking for someone to blame. One morning, the congregation of the black church arrived to find their sanctuary desecrated. Windows were smashed, pews overturned, and hateful slurs were scrawled across the walls. The attack sent shockwaves through the Ridge. People were angry, scared, and tired of being treated like they didn't belong. "We can't let them get away with this," shouted Marcus, a young man with fire in his eyes. Eli stood among the crowd, his face unreadable. He picked up a broom and began sweeping the broken glass. At first, people stared. Then, slowly, others joined him. Soon, the church was alive with movement as the congregation worked together to repair the damage. But Eli wasn't just sweeping glass that day. He was sweeping away the silence that had kept East Haven divided. The vandalism at the church was a wake-up call for Eli. He knew the town wouldn't change on its own, and he decided it was time to take action. Eli started small. He organized a meeting at the church, inviting both black and white residents to come together and talk about the issues tearing the town apart. At first, the response was lukewarm. Many people, black and white alike, were skeptical. "What good will talking do?" asked Sarah, a schoolteacher from the Ridge. But Eli was persistent. He visited homes, knocked on doors, and spoke to anyone who would listen. Slowly, people began to show up. The first meeting was tense. Voices were raised, accusations were thrown, and some people walked out. But Eli remained calm, his deep voice cutting through the noise. "We can't fix the past," he said, "but we can decide what kind of future we want for our kids. If we don't start talking to each other, nothing will ever change." It wasn't a perfect start, but it was a start nonetheless. As news of the meeting spread, East Haven became a town divided not just by race, but by opinion. Some white residents accused Eli of stirring the pot, claiming things had been fine until he started trying to bring people together. Others, particularly younger black residents, thought his approach was too soft. "What good is talking?" Marcus demanded after the third meeting. He stood at the back of the church, his arms crossed and his voice sharp. "These people don't care about us, Eli. They never have." Eli looked at him steadily. "And if we don't talk, they never will." Marcus scoffed but didn't leave. Eli had a way of keeping people in the room, even when they disagreed with him. The meetings continued, slowly growing in size. Each session was a storm of emotions, anger, fear, hope, but Eli's calm presence anchored them. He let people speak their truths, no matter how uncomfortable, and encouraged them to listen in return. One evening, after a particularly heated meeting, Eli was surprised to find Earl Simmons waiting for him outside the church. Earl was one of the wealthiest farmers in East Haven, known for his stubbornness and his disdain for anyone who challenged the status quo. "You've got guts, Carter," Earl said, his tone gruff. Eli raised an eyebrow. "Didn't expect to see you here, Earl." "I didn't come for the meeting," Earl admitted. "I came to talk to you." Eli gestured for him to continue. Earl hesitated, then sighed. "Look, I don't agree with everything you're doing. But you've got my respect. You're trying to fix something most people don't even want to admit is broken." Eli nodded. "That's a start." From that night on, Earl became a quiet supporter. He didn't attend the meetings, but he began donating supplies and resources to help rebuild the church and support families in the Ridge. His involvement sent ripples through the town, forcing others to reconsider their own prejudices. The turning point came in the middle of summer, when a fire broke out on the edge of the ridge. It started in a small field and spread quickly, consuming acres of crops and threatening nearby homes. The fire department arrived, but by the time the flames were under control, the damage was devastating. Dozens of families lost their livelihoods, and tensions in East Haven reached a boiling point. Rumors spread like wildfire. They burned their own fields for insurance money, some whispered. "Those white farmers did this to scare us," others claimed. Eli knew the truth didn't matter as much as the perception. The town was on the verge of chaos, and it was up to him to stop it. The day after the fire, Eli called an emergency meeting at the church. This time, the crowd was bigger than ever, spilling out into the street. Eli stood at the front, his hands steady on the pulpit. This fire wasn't caused by revenge or greed, he began, his voice firm. It was caused by the drought, by circumstances none of us can control. But if we let this divide us, we'll all lose. He paused, letting his words sink in. We can rebuild, but we can't do it alone. We need each other, black, white, rich, poor. If we don't come together now, East Haven won't survive. The room was silent for a long moment, and then a voice called out from the back. What do you suggest, Eli? Eli looked out at the crowd, his face resolute. We create a fund to help those who lost their crops. We donate our time, our money, whatever we can spare. This isn't about charity, it's about survival. At first, the response was hesitant. Some people donated reluctantly, while others flat out refused. But Eli didn't give up. He went door to door, talking to families, listening to their concerns, and convincing them to contribute in whatever way they could. Earl Simmons was one of the first to step up. He offered his equipment and workers to help replant the fields, surprising everyone in town. I don't like seeing people suffer, no matter who they are, Earl said gruffly when asked why he was helping. Eli spent long days in the fields, working alongside farmers, laborers, and volunteers. The lines that had once divided East Haven began to blur as people worked side by side, sharing meals and stories. For the first time in decades, the town felt like a community. Not everyone was happy with the changes. A small but vocal group resisted Eli's efforts, accusing him of overstepping his place. One night, a brick was thrown through the window of Eli's small house. Attached to it was a note that read, "Stay in your lane." Eli stared at the shattered glass, his jaw tightening. He didn't say anything, but those close to him noticed a new weariness in his eyes. Despite the threats, Eli refused to back down. He knew the road to change was never easy, and he was willing to bear the weight of resistance. By the end of the year, East Haven was a different town. The fund Eli had created became a permanent fixture, used to support families in need. The meetings at the church evolved into a community council, where decisions were made collectively. At a town gathering, Mayor Franklin stood before the crowd, clearing his throat nervously. Eli Carter, he began, you've done more for this town in a year than most of us have in a lifetime. On behalf of East Haven, I want to thank you. The crowd erupted in applause, but Eli raised his hand, silencing them. This isn't about me, he said. This is about us. East Haven isn't perfect, and it never will be. But as long as we're willing to listen to each other, to help each other, we'll be okay. Years later, East Haven became a symbol of what was possible when people chose unity over division. The town wasn't perfect, but it was better. And at the heart of it all was Eli Carter, a man who never sought recognition, but whose quiet strength changed everything. Eli's name became a legend in East Haven, a reminder of what could be achieved through resilience, compassion, and the belief that even the most broken things could be mended. East Haven continued to rebuild, not just its fields and homes but its relationships. The fund Eli started evolved into something larger, a community cooperative where families could pool resources and help one another in times of need. Eli's small house became a hub for ideas and collaboration. People from both sides of town would stop by to drop off donations, share concerns, or just sit on his porch and talk. It wasn't unusual to see children from the ridge playing in Eli's yard alongside kids from the wealthier neighborhoods, their laughter a hopeful melody that carried through the streets. Earl Simmons became one of Eli's closest allies. The once gruff farmer softened as he spent more time working alongside the people he had once dismissed. He and Eli often spent evenings sitting on Eli's porch, discussing what the town needed next. Didn't think I'd live to see the day we'd be building something together, Earl admitted one night, tipping his hat back as he leaned against the porch railing. Eli smiled. Didn't think I'd see it either. But it's good to prove ourselves wrong sometimes. Not everyone embraced the changes. The resistance against Eli's efforts became more coordinated as East Haven's transformation gained attention from neighboring towns. "You're making us look weak," someone shouted during a town meeting, their voice dripping with anger. Eli met the accusation with calm resolve. "Unity isn't weakness," he said firmly. "It's strength. And if we can show that here, in East Haven, it'll spread further than we can imagine." But behind closed doors, Eli knew the threats were becoming more dangerous. He often found notes left on his porch or heard whispers in the streets about people who wanted him gone. One night, as he returned home from a meeting, he found his porch light smashed and a crude message scrawled across the front door, "Traitor." Eli stood in the darkness, his chest tight. For the first time, he felt the weight of fear pressing down on him. But as he stepped inside, he saw the faces of the people he was fighting for flash in his mind: young mothers with children on their hips, elderly men who had shared their wisdom, kids who played in his yard without a care in the world. He couldn't stop. The most significant challenge came in the form of an outside group. News of East Haven's progress had reached a nearby town known for its deep-rooted racism. A group of men arrived one evening, driving trucks with loud engines and louder voices, determined to send a message. They gathered in front of the church, shouting threats and waving symbols of hate. The people of East Haven watched from their windows, fear gripping their hearts. Some wanted to fight back, others wanted to hide, but Eli had a different plan. He walked out into the street, his shoulders squared, and stood in front of the church. Behind him, the lights of the homes began to flicker on, one by one, as people stepped outside to join him. Mothers, fathers, children, and elderly residents, all of them stood together, silently facing the intruders. "What do you think you're doing?" one of the men barked, stepping forward. Eli's voice was calm but firm. "We're standing together. You can shout all you want, but this is our town, and you don't belong here." The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, it seemed as though violence was inevitable. But the sight of the entire community, black and white, rich and poor, standing as one was a force greater than anger. The intruders left that night, their threats empty against the unity of East Haven. The events of that night solidified Eli's place in the town's history. The unity he had fought so hard to build was now unshakable. East Haven was no longer just a town struggling with its past, it was a beacon of hope for what could be achieved when people chose compassion over division. Eli never sought recognition for his efforts, but it found him anyway. His name began appearing in local newspapers, and people from neighboring towns came to East Haven to learn how they had bridged their divides. The cooperative fund grew into a community center named the East Haven Unity Center. It offered classes, childcare, and job training for anyone who needed it, and Eli was often found there, fixing a leaky faucet or mentoring a young person looking for guidance. Years later, Eli's porch became quieter. He still greeted neighbors with his warm smile and worked with his hands, but he began to slow down. The years of hard labor and the emotional weight of his fight had taken their toll. One autumn evening, as the leaves turned gold and red, Eli sat on his porch with Earl and Pastor Edwards. They talked about the changes in East Haven, the new families moving in, and the laughter that now echoed through the streets. "You did it, Eli," Earl said, his voice gruff but full of admiration. Eli shook his head. "We did it. This town didn't change because of me. It changed because of all of us." Eli passed away quietly in his sleep that winter, leaving behind a town forever altered by his quiet courage. East Haven continued to grow and thrive, its history preserved not as a source of shame, but as a lesson in resilience and unity. The Unity Center became the heart of the town, its walls filled with photographs and stories of the people who had built it. Eli's name was etched into a plaque at the entrance, alongside the words that had defined his life. "Unity isn't weakness. It's strength." Generations later, children in East Haven would hear stories of the quiet handyman who stood against hate and brought a town together. His legacy lived on in the laughter of its people, the strength of its community, and the unbreakable bond forged in the heart of a divided town. Thank you so much for watching this video and taking the time to explore this fascinating story with us. If you enjoyed this content, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means the world to us, and God bless us all.